Hello folks, and welcome to this next video in the iRacing Essentials series. Focus for today is on the different configuration files that we have for iRacing. There's a number of them. Some of them are better known than others. The renderer DX11 files, for example, you can make some adjustments to graphic settings with that one. The app.ini file controls some other configurable options, but there's also others related to the button mapping, as well as the steering wheel and pedal calibration. So the purpose of today's video is to talk you through each file, let you know what each file does and what it controls within the sim. And then finally, I'll just take you through some of the hidden settings or more useful settings that you can find within the files, some of which actually can't be found within the UI itself. So let's get into it. So to find these configuration files, head over to your iRacing documents folder. Scroll down to the bottom and then you'll see a number of these files listed. So we've got the app.ini file, camera, controls.cfg, core, fuel data, joyCalib, and the renderer DX11 monitor file. Now, if you're running in VR, the renderer DX11 file will be called something slightly different, but otherwise, all of these configuration files should appear for all of us in the sim. Okay, so first up, let's take a look at the app.ini file. So I'll just double click it here. If it doesn't open automatically for you, you can just select Windows Notepad as the program, and then it should open and look just like this. Now, this file basically controls a lot of the in-sim settings that are not related to graphics. So it's quite a powerful tool. That said, a lot of the settings in here can just be configured in the sim. So it's not necessarily something that you need to come and spend a ton of time in. You can make adjustments in the sim. The benefit often with making adjustments to the file here is you can fine-tune a little bit more than you are able to with the UI in the sim. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. So I'm not going to talk through every section, but I will just chat through some of the key settings that I think are quite useful. So this first big section is related to audio. As I said, a lot of this can be configured in the sim. That said, if I just highlight this area here, the one difference is you can see you've got loudness, ambient crash engine, etc. You can fine tune this a little bit more in the file than you can with the sliders in the sim. I don't tend to find that I need to do that, but if you're really trying to fine tune a particular part of the sim audio, then this would be the place to do it. Another interesting setting that's kind of buried away in here is this downshiftProtectionNoise enabled. So you can get the sim to play a warning noise when a downshift is not allowed. Can be interesting. Of course, the sim won't allow you to downshift anyway. I have this set to off, but kind of a useful little feature just in case you enjoy having that extra noise in your ear. Auto chat messages, this is just a place where you would make edits or updates to any of the auto chat messages that you would use in the sim. Simple enough. Bass shaker, if you have an LFE device connected, this is where you can configure it, but just like audio, you can do all of this within the in-sim UI as well. And then like audio, it just allows you to do some finer tuning adjustments if you feel the need to do so. This section on camera tools, I haven't really played around with this too much. It's pretty self-explanatory in terms of what the settings do. The one that I would flag would be this camTempEdit. If you're in a replay and you're adjusting camera views, maybe to have a look at some damage that you've sustained and you just want to see what's what, just make sure that this is set to 0 because then it's going to not save the edits to the cameras when you leave the sim. That said, if you are making edits to the cameras and actually you're doing it because you want them to save, then of course you can have this set back to 1. But can be quite useful if you're making temporary edits to camera views whilst you're in the sim, but you want them to be reset back to default the next time that you get in. We're going down a little bit further. There's some black box settings here. Again, pretty self-explanatory. External display section. Again, this is editable within the sim, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Now, force feedback. This is quite useful. Again, a lot of this is in the in-sim UI, but there are a couple of areas here I just want to flag as we go through. One of the newer pieces of, I guess, software integration that's come out in the last 12 months or so has been this 360 hertz force feedback, and then the integration specifically with APIs for various wheelbases. So this should be set to on by default, so it should say 1, but worth double checking. If you know you have a wheel that can support 360 hertz feedback, you know it's got the right API. This is where you would double check that that's set to on. And then if you actually want to double check that the APIs themselves are enabled, then you just come down to this section a little bit lower, and you can see there's one for Asetek, Conspit, Fanatec, Moza, Simagic, Simucube, and VRS. Again, by default, these should all be set to 1. I haven't adjusted mine. I'm using a Simucube wheel, so set to 1. All works just fine. But if you're having any issues with that 360 hertz feedback, this is the section just to double check to make sure everything is working correctly. Another setting that's quite useful in this section is this debounce sequential. I'm just going to highlight this for you. So I think mine is set to the default value. I'm not 100% sure, but basically if you're getting any issues with double shifts, you can adjust this setting and it basically adds a delay in milliseconds, as it says, to the sequential shifter to reduce double shifts. So probably not something that you need to adjust, but useful to know it's there if you're ever finding that you're shifting and it's actually jumping 2 gears. There's a way to increase the delay in milliseconds so the sim is not seeing both of those inputs, and so gets rid of that issue. Okay, if we carry on further down, this is quite an important setting, but it's also one that appears in the sim, so not too important to adjust in this file, but it's basically the limit to the number of cars that are transmitted to the client, values from 10 to 64. I have this set to 63, which does increase a little bit of the CPU work, but that's just to make sure that when I've got overlays running, that the overlay can see the data from all of the cars that are potentially in the race. But as I said, this is also configurable directly in the UI, so it's pretty simple just to do there. Okay, as we go a little bit further down, there's a miscellaneous section. A couple of things in here actually that I quite like. So I'm just going to highlight these at the bottom. So you've got the show incident messages whilst driving. Most of us are going to want these on. You can see mine is set to 1 here. That just is a text message that can appear on the screen whilst you're driving around. You can configure where that message is displayed by adjusting that in-sim UI and the layout. But there's a few other things that I actually have switched off because I don't like them popping up whilst driving. So these bottom 3 here, the showJoinLeave, if this is set to 1, or on in the sim, and this is going to show you a text message on the screen whilst you're driving every time a player joins or leaves. I just don't see the need for that, so I have that turned to off. And then it's exactly the same behavior for system messages and user chat messages. You might want to see user chat messages potentially whilst you're driving. I don't like the distraction, so I have both of these set to off, but this is the way to control the messages that the sim is going to show you whilst you're driving. So quite useful and good to know that you can adjust it and turn it off from here. Pit service box. If you're not using the auto fuel pit service, then this is probably less useful, but just to draw your attention to it, a couple of cool settings here. This will, whether auto fuel is enabled by default, set to 1, so I do use auto fuel in iRacing. Mine is set to 1. If you set it to 0, it'll just stay disabled unless you manually enable it in the sim. What is the default margin in terms of laps to use by default? So mine is set to 0.8 laps. And again, you can adjust this to whatever you want. So quite useful. And what that means is when auto fuel is switched on and you're in the sim, this is going to be the default margin that it gives you every race. So if you don't change anything, that's what it's going to give you extra. And then the last 2 settings, whether you automatically request the fast repair once your vehicle exits pit road, and then the same whether it requests a full pit service. So what this means is you don't have to go back into the black box pit settings to switch on whether you want the full pit service and the fast repair to reappear. So you may want to use those, you may not, but just useful to know that it's this section where you can control those. And then there's a few things to adjust here on the replay, but this is all configurable in the sim, so I don't tend to make any adjustments in here. But there are things such as, whether you want the sim to ask you to save the replay before quitting. This is also a button inside the UI. And then there's just a number of other adjustments that you can make here as related to the replay. So it's quite a powerful file. There's all sorts of adjustments you can make. But as I said, you don't need to get lost in here. It's really about picking through the specific settings that you either want to fine tune in this file or the ones that are not visible in the UI and you want to enable through this. And then really as we get to the bottom, just a couple to close out. SPCC, so that's related to the iRacing spotter. If you have this switched off because you're using a third-party spotter, then of course nothing to worry about here. But if you do use the in-game spotter, all sorts of additional configuration you can make in this file that you can't do in the in-sim UI. There's too many for me to go through, so I'm not going to talk through any in detail, but it is worth having a look through because you can, adjust, whether, these are two that I quite like. Mute spotter if live. So, do you want the spotter to be muted if you actually have a live spotter already spotting for you, i.e. you have someone else who's in the sim and is watching the replay live and is doing live spotting? I have this set to off because even if I have someone in the sim, I still want the iRacing spotter to be talking to me. And then same, if you have that live spotter and someone's in the sim with you, do you want the iRacing spotter to reduce its chattiness? So there's all sorts of interesting settings like that. So it's worth taking a look through these if you use the in-game spotter. It's quite powerful, some of the fine-tuning adjustments that you can make here, which is pretty cool. I just realized there's one or a couple of key settings that I missed from the replay section that I do want to draw your attention to because you can't make these adjustments in the sim. 3 in total. Do you want to pause the replay on exit? So basically when you get out of the car, do you want the sim basically to enter a pause state? I dislike that. I like it to keep on running. So I have this set to 0. I think the default is 1 here. And then these are 2 settings right underneath there, which I didn't know existed until about a year into the sim and I think are very useful. Basically, the number of seconds to back up from the end when exiting the car in either a non-team session or in a team session. Now, by default, there is a bit of a delay here. The challenge is if you're ever in a race and you're spotting someone else, if you don't realize this, then you can actually not be watching live because you get out the car, you get into replay mode, but you're actually a couple of seconds behind the live action, basically. So I have this set to 0 in both cases so that whenever I jump out of the car, I know it's always going to be live. And because I have pause replay on exit set to 0, basically I jump out of the car and then I'm immediately watching the live action. So I'm not really sure why this adds a delay. I'm sure there's a reason for it. As I said, I think the default is to have a delay. I think it's super useful just to have this back at 0 so you know you're always watching the live action every time you jump out of the car. Okay, so next up, let's have a look at the camera.ini. Same way of opening it. This generally shouldn't be a file that you need to edit. All it's showing you is where you've got specific cameras saved for particular cars. Now, if you've seen one of my earlier videos on seating position, you'll know about how to save custom cameras for the cockpit view so that it effectively sets your seating position every time you get in the car. If you've done that, you will see those listed here. So you can see for the NSX, I've got a default cockpit camera, same for the Audi R8, BMW, etc., etc. So there shouldn't be a need to ever edit in here, but this is a good way to double check. If you think you've got some camera views saved, then you can jump into this file and then you can just double check that. The next file to look at will be the core.ini file. I know there's a controls.cfg file. I'll come back to that one towards the end because it's a unique file in terms of how you would edit that and open it. But if we open up core, similar to camera, not a file you should ever really need to edit. Feel free to have a bit of a read through, but it's governing things like, how the communications work for iRacing. It's got some debug sections. It talks about, specific settings around the sound and how the worker boosts work from a CPU perspective. So unless you're being guided to go into this file by, say, someone like an iRacing support person, shouldn't ever be a need to edit this. So probably one just to leave alone, but feel free to open it, have a look and see some of the settings that are in here. Okay, onto fuel data. We can just double click this one. Again, shouldn't be a file you ever need to edit, because really what this is it's just a log of fuel data when you're running different cars. And what this does is it helps the iRacing auto fuel system have an understanding of kind of predicted fuel usage for a given car at a given track. So if you're interested to see the data that it's logging from a fuel perspective, you can get in here. If you want to reset what it is captured for you, you can just delete the file and it'll be recreated. But otherwise, no reason really to jump into this file and make any adjustments to it. joyCalib is another file, can be opened in Notepad, but it's a bit of a unique file again, so I'm going to come to that at the end alongside the controls.cfg file. Instead, let's just skip ahead to the renderer DX11 monitor file. As I said, if you run in VR, the file name will be slightly different, but it governs the same settings. Effectively, this is the file that allows you to fine-tune graphic settings that are in the sim, whether it is the in-car graphics options, i.e. the graphics tab in the UI, or it's the replay graphics options. Both are highly configurable in here. Now, just like the app.ini file, almost all of these settings can just be adjusted in the sim itself. And I would say that's probably the easier way to do it, unless you know the specific setting that you're looking for. But also, like the app.ini file, you're able to fine-tune some of the settings in more detail in this file than you can in the sim. So feel free to have a look, have a play around. Generally, I recommend making adjustments to graphic settings just in the sim itself. I think it's just easier, but it's good to know that when you make those adjustments, this is the file where it's capturing the changes, and it's this file that iRacing is loading every time you jump into the sim. So this first section is all about the in-car graphics. As I said, lots of configurable options in here. If we head on down, the settings related to user options, talking about the UI transparency, whether there's a couple of settings here that I think are quite useful that aren't in the sim itself. You can force all movable controls to become visible when moving UI elements. So when you're in the sim and you're in the car, or indeed when you're in the replay view, if you want to move the position of various UI elements because you just want them in a different place, maybe you're running overlays and therefore you want to move some of the in-sim UI in a different place. Well, if you hit this ForceVisibleWhenMove equals 1, when you hit Alt-K and you're in the sim and you're adjusting, you'll be able to see every movable element, whether it has data and is showing you information or not. So that can be quite useful. Another one that I use from time to time is if you're making some adjustments to graphic settings and you want to get an understanding of if you have a full crowd, just kind of the impact of that. Well, because when you're in a test session, you don't tend to have the crowd visible. What you can do is you can come in here, you can set forceCrowdVisible equals 1, and then even in a test session, it'll fill the crowds with people like it would on a race day. So it gives you a better sense of the pull on your CPU and GPU when you're making graphics adjustments. So that can be something that's quite useful. A couple of others above that I realized I missed as I whizzed through this first section. Just going to highlight these two. SysMemToUse and VidMemToUse. This is not something you can adjust in the sim itself anymore. You used to be able to via a couple of sliders. It's also a setting that you probably don't need to adjust, but if you ever want to check just how much VRAM, i.e. your GPU RAM, iRacing is able to use, or the system RAM, how much it's able to use, then you can check in here just to make sure that it's using a decent amount. Now for me, I've got 32 gigabytes of video memory, so if iRacing is trying to use 16, totally fine. So I'm fine with that. And then the same, I've got 64 gigabytes of system RAM, and here iRacing is set to use 32768, which is the maximum as it says here. So if you're ever worried about RAM issues or how much RAM is allocated to iRacing, you can come in here, you can just double check, and then up to a maximum, you can make certain adjustments. This is something that the sim configures on its own, and most of the time you won't ever need to touch it, but just useful to know where it is. Another useful one is in this drive screen section. Just one setting in here that I do always adjust when I reinstall the sim. You can change the size of the virtual mirror. So within the UI itself, you can adjust the FOV, the field of view, the virtual mirror, but in here you can adjust the physical size of it on your screen. For me, the default value 1 of medium is just a bit too big. I prefer it to be slightly smaller, so I set mine to 2, and you've actually got quite a few configurable settings here, all the way from 0 to large down to 4 for extra small. So this is quite a useful one to adjust. Now, the rest of the items in here, I'm not going to go through in any detail. If you're setting up triple screens, this display portion is important, as well as monitor setup. Monitor setup also governs field of view settings, which you can see here, just these ones at the bottom. Again, configurable in the sim for this monitor setup, so generally you won't need to edit it in here. However, for triples, and I cover this in an earlier triple setup video, there are adjustments that you need to make physically in this file in order for iRacing to recognize that you have triple screens. So I won't go into it here, but that is where you make those adjustments. And then carrying on down, the final section here is another big one, and this governs the replay graphics, which is very similar to the in-car graphics, just an opportunity to be able to fine-tune some of the graphics. But again, I recommend making those adjustments in the sim itself and only coming to make adjustments to the replay graphics or the in-sim graphics if you're trying to fine-tune a very specific graphics setting. Okay, so to close out, we're going to talk quickly about the joyCalib file and the controls.cfg file. Let's start with the joyCalib file. What this one does is a very simple file, but it takes a look at your hardware, i.e. steering wheel and pedals, so the input devices that the sim is going to use. It takes a copy of what's called the instance GUID. So if you ever reinstall Windows, this is something that changes. For every device, it gets allocated a new one basically, but so long as you don't reinstall Windows, the device ID will stay all the way throughout, which is good. And basically, when you configure either the wheelbase or the pedals within the sim, this is where it is marking down the values, basically, that it is saved in the sim. So again, not normally a file that you need to come in here and edit unless you know you're trying to make very specific setting changes. I find this file quite useful if I want to add dead zones towards the beginning and the end of my kind of pedal throws. And so I know what the specifics value are for me because I've tested them out in the sim. But just useful to know that when you do the configuration, so you do the calibration physically in the sim, when you go through the kind of the turning the wheels and depressing the pedals, this is the file where it is storing those values. You can open it in Windows Notepad, make any edits that you need to, but generally you just leave it as is. The final thing to add is if you are creating custom controls for cars, which most of us will do, the sim will take a copy of this file, and I'll just show you, and it makes a copy, another version of it basically, in the setup folder. So if I go into the McLaren, for example, because I've been driving this quite a bit, you can see at the bottom here, there's another joyCalib file. So right now, this is just a duplicate for me, but if I wanted, I could adjust my sort of steering wheel calibration or pedal calibration specifically for this car, and it would be saved differently in here to what the default joyCalib file is. So kind of useful to know. I don't do that. I just keep it the same for every car. But if you are switching from, maybe open wheel to tin top, and it's different enough that you want the pedals to react differently or the steering to react differently, you do have the ability to do that in the sim. And it's this file that would be duplicated, and then the edits would be saved here on a per car basis. Okay, last but not least, the controls.cfg file. Now, if you try and open this with Notepad, it will technically open, But as you can see, it is not editable in the same way that the other .ini files are and the joyCalib file. It's a bit of a mess. What is this file doing? So it is controlling the button mapping that you're setting in the sim. And this, like the joyCalib file, is the default one. So when you jump into a new car for the first time, this will be the default button mapping that is assigned. If you do custom button mapping for different cars, then just like the joyCalib file, if you go into setups, if we go into McLaren here, you'll see that file duplicated, and that allows you in the sim to create different button mapping on a per car basis, which is great. Now, the only reason for just showing you this file and letting you know what it does is because you can actually edit this outside of the sim. You just need a third-party program to do so. There's a few out there, and I'm not going to endorse any particular one. The one I use from time to time is this iRacing controls editor, so I'll just open that up for us real quickly. So it's quite a nice UI. You can kind of go through on a per car basis or the default controls. Now, in general, I won't ever come into here. I'll just do all my button mapping in the sim itself. I find it works just fine. However, if you ever reinstall iRacing or reinstall Windows, the controls.cfg file, you can save it, you can reload it, but you will physically have to do the button mapping again in the sim, unless you use a third-party application like this one, where you can basically reattach the different button mapping back to the devices. And the reason why just loading the old file won't work after a reinstall or adding a new device is the sim doesn't know which control on the device to map the button to, so you need to tell it basically what the device is. So you can just go through and redo the button mapping in the sim, but if you don't want to make any changes to it, you can just come into a third-party application like this one and assign the right button to the right device, which is something that can save a little bit of time. That's all I've got for this one. These files are super useful, although you shouldn't need to be making edits to them all the time. It is really good to know what each of the configuration files govern, the settings that they control, and in particular, those hidden settings that you cannot adjust in the sim, but you are able to edit in the configuration files. Just allows you to personalize the sim just a little bit more to your liking. Final piece of guidance would be to always make backups of these files, at least on a monthly basis. That way, if you ever have to reinstall iRacing or reinstall Windows, you can just copy the files back and you don't lose things like the graphics settings, some of your fuel history data, the camera positions, etc. So just a good practice to make regular backups of those files. There'll be another video in the iRacing Essentials series that's coming out next weekend. But until then, thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.